The only real difference between him and Basil is that he was small and had a very large henpecking wife.
So I didn't have any problems with saying what I didn't think was funny. No, I don't believe that. Why does he say that?
For 12 episodes, spread thinly across 4 years, a fictional hotel on the English coast produced some of the most quoted comedy in television history. Fawlty Towers never had a long run. It never needed one. Within a handful of half-hour episodes, it built a reputation as one of the sharpest, most meticulously constructed sitcoms the BBC ever broadcast. And yet, decades after it left the air on its own terms, one single episode did something none of the show's chaos, slamming doors, or screaming matches ever managed. It got Fawlty Towers pulled from a streaming platform. Not because of a plot twist gone wrong, not because audiences turn on Basil Fawlty's meltdowns, but because of a handful of lines spoken by a minor character, lines that had aged so badly, they overshadowed everything else in the episode. This is the story of how that moment happened, why it happened, and what it says about a show that was never really about who it seemed to be about. Long before Basil Fawlty existed on paper, there was a real hotel on the English Riviera and a real man behind its front desk who made the fictional version look almost restrained by comparison. In May 1970, the Monty Python team checked into the Gleneagles Hotel in Torquay, Devon, while filming location scenes for their sketch show. What they expected was a place to sleep between takes. What they got was a masterclass in hospitality done backwards. The hotel's co-owner, Donald Sinclair, treated his guests less like paying customers and more like intruders he hadn't yet found a way to remove. He criticized Terry Gilliam's table manners for being, in his estimation, too American. When Eric Idle left his briefcase in the lobby for a moment, Sinclair didn't ask around to find its owner. He picked it up and threw it over a garden wall, convinced it might be an explosive device. When someone later asked why anyone would want to bomb his hotel, Sinclair reportedly answered that he'd had a lot of staff problems lately, as if that explained anything at all. It was such an alarming overreaction to a stray piece of luggage that most of the Python troupe packed up and found somewhere else to stay for the rest of the shoot. 2 people didn't leave. John Cleese and his then-wife, Connie Booth, stuck around, and where his colleagues saw an unpleasant few nights, Cleese saw something closer to a character study. He later described Sinclair as the rudest man he had ever encountered in his life, and he meant it as something close to a compliment. The kind of grudging admiration a writer feels for a real person who behaves so absurdly that fiction almost can't compete. Cleese watched Sinclair snap at staff, hover with suspicion over ordinary requests, and generally run his hotel as though every guest was a personal inconvenience he hadn't asked for. A waitress who worked under Sinclair later called him simply unsuited to the job, a man who seemed constitutionally incapable of hospitality despite having built an entire business around it. Sinclair sold to Gleneagles in 1973, 2 years before Fawlty Towers reached television screens, and by most accounts he never grasped that he'd inspired anything at all. He died in Torquay in 1981, reportedly unaware that a particular brand of chaos had been immortalized nationwide. His widow was considerably less amused when the connection became public knowledge years later. She told an interviewer that she regarded Cleese as something close to a fool who had built a fortune by holding her family up to ridicule, and she insisted her husband was nothing like the character he'd apparently inspired. Whatever the truth of that, the resemblance was close enough that Cleese would go on to actually name a hotelier character Donald Sinclair in an unrelated film decades later, a wink that the real Sinclair family did not find especially funny. What Cleese took from Torquay wasn't a transcript of events. It was a temperament, a man convinced he was running a tight, respectable establishment, while everything around him quietly fell apart because of his own behavior. That tension between self-image and reality became the entire engine of the show. He would eventually write, understand why Cleese was primed to notice a man like Sinclair at all. It helps to look at where he came from. He grew up in Weston-super-Mare, an only child in a household where his father had gone to trouble of legally changing the family surname from the somewhat unfortunate Cheese to Cleese years before his son was born, apparently unwilling to send a boy through school with that particular last name intact. Cleese grew tall early, well over 6 feet by his young teens, which meant he stood out physically long before anyone noticed he was funny. He attended a preparatory school paid for by family money, and it was there that 2 habits took root that would define his later work: a fascination with language and a close, almost anthropological attention to how people behaved, especially when they behaved badly. He wasn't simply a class clown. He was, even as a schoolboy, quietly cataloging the absurdities of the adults and institutions around him, whether or not he understood at the time that this was what he was doing. That habit showed up in small, sharp acts of mischief, like painting a trail of footprints leading away from a war memorial statue at his secondary school, as if the statue itself had wandered off. It was a schoolboy prank, but it was also a very specific kind of joke, visual, dry, and built on the gap between solemn appearances and ridiculous reality, which is more or less the exact recipe he'd used professionally 2 decades later. Not every formative moment was funny. At 17, Cleese was passed over for a leadership position at school despite a strong academic record, and he later said the experience shifted how he thought about fairness and the people who hand out authority. That skepticism toward pompous, undeserving figures in charge would eventually curdle into some of his best-known comic writing. University plans were delayed by a temporary crunch in available places, so instead of heading straight to Cambridge, Cleese spent a year back at his old prep school, this time as a teacher, covering Latin, science, English, and history. It's a detail that sounds like a footnote, except that his Latin lessons would resurface, almost word for word in spirit, in a scene he later wrote for Monty Python's Life of Brian, in which his character corrects the grammar on a piece of anti-Roman graffiti. Nothing in his early life seemed to go to waste creatively. It all got filed away. He eventually made it to Downing College, Cambridge, to study law, a career path his father kept hoping he'd fall back on well into adulthood, still mailing him newspaper clippings for retail management jobs years after Cleese had a law degree in hand. But law lost out almost by accident. At a student activities fair, representatives from a university's famous Footlights Comedy Club asked if he could sing or dance. He told them bluntly that if there was anything worse than his dancing, it was his singing. Asked what he could do instead. He said simply that he could make people laugh. That was enough to get him in the door. At Footlights, Cleese met the collaborators who would define the next decade of his career, including a young performer named Graham Chapman. And together with several others, they began building the kind of absurdist, cerebral comedy that would eventually reshape British television entirely. Fawlty Towers didn't arrive as a solo brainwave. It came out of a partnership, and specifically out of a marriage between Cleese and Connie Booth. After the Torquay experience lodged itself in Cleese's memory, it sat there for years before the two of them decided to actually build a show around it, rather than simply retell what had happened at the Gleneagles. They exaggerated it, sharpened it, and built an entire ensemble of characters around a single, doomed hotelier trying and failing to project respectability. When Fawlty Towers premiered on the BBC in September 1975, the reception from critics was lukewarm at best. Reviewers found the pacing frantic and the plots overstuffed, missing that the chaos was the entire point rather than flawed to be corrected. Audiences, however, responded immediately. Basil Fawlty's barely contained fury, his wife Sybil's icy authority, the unflappable competence of Polly, and the perpetual confusion of the Spanish waiter Manuel gave the show an ensemble dynamic that clicked instantly with viewers even as critics scratched their heads. The BBC wasn't initially convinced this reaction would hold. After the first 6 episodes aired, there was serious internal discussion about whether the show was worth continuing at all. It was only once Rerun started building a larger, more devoted audience that the network agreed to commission a second series. That second batch of 6 episodes didn't arrive until 1979, for years after the first series, and by the time filming started, Cleese and Booth's marriage had ended. They kept working together anyway, finishing the show as creative partners even after their relationship as spouses was over, and by most accounts the professionalism between them never wavered on set. It would be the last time the two of them worked together, and the 12 episodes they produced across those 2 series remain, to this day, the entirety of the original show out of the 12 episodes ever made. One in particular has generated more discussion, more defense, and more controversy than the other 11 combined. It's called The Germans, and it originally aired in the show's first series. The premise finds Basil concussed after being struck on the head, left to run the hotel in a fog while a party of German tourists checks in. Terrified of causing offense, Basil orders his staff not to bring up the war under any circumstances, and then proceeds to do exactly that, spiraling into an increasingly deranged monologue about the Second World War that culminates in him goose-stepping to the dining room in a garbled impression of Adolf Hitler while his German guests look on in horror. It's a broad, almost farcical sequence, and it was clearly designed as satire of British obsession with the war rather than attack on German people. Cleese has said as much repeatedly over the years, arguing that the joke was always aimed squarely at Basil's own idiocy and Britain's cultural fixation on a war 3 decades gone, not at the German tourists who simply wanted a quiet holiday. Basil, in this reading, isn't a mouthpiece for the writers. He's the target of the joke, a man so consumed by anxiety about causing offense that he causes maximum offense instead. For years, the goose-stepping scene was a part of the episode people argued about, some finding it uncomfortable regardless of its satirical intent, others insisting the framing made the target obvious. But that's not actually the scene that got the episode pulled from a streaming service decades later. That distinction belongs to a different, much shorter moment earlier in the same half hour, June 2020. In the middle of a wider cultural reckoning following the death of George Floyd in the United States and the resulting Black Lives Matter protests that spread internationally, the streaming platform UKTV, which is owned by BBC Studios, quietly pulled the Germans from its catalog. The stated reason was the presence of racial slurs, and the company said it wanted time to review the episode before deciding how, or whether, to bring it back. The scene in question isn't the one most people remember. Before the German guests ever arrive, there's an earlier exchange in which the elderly, doddering Major Goen, a semi-senile former military man who appears throughout the series, rambles to Basil about a cricket match and uses a racial slur more than once to describe West Indian and Indian players. The line has nothing to do with the German storyline at all. It's a brief, jarring moment of casual, old-fashioned bigotry from a character that the show consistently frames as a relic out of touch, faintly ridiculous, and not someone the audience is meant to admire or agree with. That distinction mattered enormously to how people reacted to removal, and it's a distinction that got lost in a lot of the public conversation at the time. Plenty of people online assumed the episode had been pulled because of the German jokes or Basil's goose-stepping, and reacted accordingly, either defending the show's right to be edgy about the war or arguing that old material simply doesn't age well. Cleese himself, when he weighed in publicly, was careful to point toward the real source of the problem rather than the assumption. He argued that there's a meaningful difference between a show attacking a prejudiced attitude directly and a show putting that attitude in the mouth of an obviously foolish character specifically, so the audience can laugh at him rather than with him. In his view, the Major's lines were never meant as an endorsement of anything. They were meant to expose exactly how absurd and outdated that kind of thinking was, in the same tradition as other British sitcoms of the era that used bigoted characters as figures of ridicule rather than role models. Cleese didn't stop at a general defense. He went further, publicly criticizing the BBC and its subsidiaries as timid, saying executives were more interested in avoiding backlash than standing behind the show's original intent. He pointed out, accurately, that streaming versions on other platforms like Netflix had already trimmed the Major's specific lines years earlier without pulling the entire episode, suggesting to him that a more targeted edit, rather than a wholesale removal, would have made more sense. UKTV's removal turned out to be short-lived. Within days, the company announced it would reinstate the episode, this time with added context and a content warning acknowledging the outdated and offensive language contained in certain scenes, rather than leaving the episode off the platform indefinitely. It was a compromise of sorts. The show stayed available, but audiences encountering it for the first time would now be told up front that some of what they were about to watch reflected attitudes the broadcaster no longer endorsed. The episode's history didn't end there, either. Years later, when Cleese adapted Fawlty Towers for a West End stage production, he made a decision himself to cut the Major's racial slurs from the script entirely, even while keeping the war-obsessed, goose-stepping Basil material fully intact. It was a telling choice. Cleese wasn't backing away from the parts of the episode built around satire of British attitudes toward Germany. He was specifically removing the lines that had never really been about satire in the first place, lines that simply repeated a slur rather than commenting on one. Asked about it, he's continued to insist that German audiences themselves have rarely taken offense at the war-related material, noting that when a German-language remake of the show was produced, the first thing local broadcasters wanted to screen for him was that very episode. The 2020 removal wasn't the first time the Germans had generated disagreement, just the most consequential. From a moment it aired in 1975, the episode split viewers roughly along the same lines it would decades later. A large portion of the British audience laughed without reservation, reading Basil's meltdown exactly as intended. A portrait of a man so anxious about British wartime pride that he becomes the very thing he's trying to avoid being. To this camp, the episode wasn't about Germany at all. It was about England, and specifically about a certain strain of Englishmen who couldn't let the 1940s go, dressed up as a farce so broad that missing the point required real effort. Others weren't so sure the framing did all the work it needed to. Some viewers, including a handful of BBC executives at the time, worried that a scene this vivid, a British hotelier goose-stepping across a dining room, while barking Nazi salutes at bewildered guests, risked landing as spectacle first and satire second, regardless of authorial intent. That tension between what a joke is aimed at and what it actually shows on screen has followed the episode for its entire life, resurfacing every few years whenever the show gets rediscovered by a new audience or reassessed by an old one. The response from Germany itself has generally been calmer than the debate playing out in Britain. Cleese has pointed more than once to his experience visiting Cologne for a German-language stage adaptation of the show, where producers were eager to screen him the very episode some British commentators assumed Germans would find most offensive. Viewers there, by his account, tended to recognize the satire for what it was, a joke about British neurosis rather than German character, delivered by a clearly ridiculous Englishman rather than anyone meant to be taken seriously. That's not to say every German viewer who has seen the episode has responded the same way. For anyone with family history tied directly to the war, a scene built around a caricature of Hitler, however clearly mocking its speaker rather than its subject, can land as tone-deaf regardless of the writer's intentions. Comedy about a subject that heavy rarely produces a single universal reaction, and the Germans has never been an exception to that rule. Part of what makes a 2020 story worth untangling carefully is how easily the two separate issues, the war-themed satire and the major slurs, get folded into a single narrative. On the surface, that's understandable. Both live inside the same 29 minutes of television. Both involve prejudice as subject matter. Both have been cited at various points as reasons the episode makes some modern viewers uncomfortable. But they're not the same kind of joke, and they don't function the same way. The goose-stepping sequence works entirely because of Basil's specific, established idiocy. The show has spent an entire episode establishing him as concussed, panicked,